Committee on Oversight and Accountability and ordered printed. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the topic of this special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an important week in the House of Representatives as we discuss several issues important to the Americans across the country, from standing up for Jewish students in the midst of dangerous anti-Semitic rhetoric and demonstrations being tolerated at universities across the country, to denouncing the Biden administration for their mishandling of the crisis at our southern border. It was also Lands Week this week, and the House Republicans proudly championed and passed legislation that will unleash American energy, promote outdoor access, and support local communities. In my home state of Utah, we are deeply concerned about the Biden administration's federal land overreach that is stifling economic growth, national security, and recreation opportunities. I want to thank my colleague for joining me this evening on a flyout day, no less, and I will gladly yield to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Mann, so much time as he may consume.
I want to thank the gentleman from Utah, my friend, for having this special order tonight to once again highlight the failures of the Biden administration on our southern border. Since President Biden's first day in office, he has failed our nation by refusing to secure the southern border. During his first year, President Biden reversed several of President Trump's policies that were effective in addressing illegal immigration. President Biden stopped construction of the border wall, even though it was already funded. Instead, he paid contractors $6 million a day while he studied the border. President Biden ended President Trump's Remain in Mexico policy before the Supreme Court forced him to reinforce it. President Biden came into office hyper-fixated on implementing radical policies to appease progressive activists, and in turn, he has left our southern border wide open. Since he was sworn in, there have been more than 9.2 million illegal immigrant encounters across the country, nearly 3 times the population of my home state of Kansas. More than 1.8 million of those illegal immigrants have evaded the U.S. Border Patrol and slipped into the country. There have been at least 350 encounters with individuals on the terrorist watch list and more than 24,000 encounters with Chinese nationals. Make no mistake, the Mexican cartels have been empowered by President Biden's failed policies, and they are cashing in by helping people all across the globe illegally enter our great country. As a result, we've had more drugs on our streets and crimes in our neighborhoods. Fentanyl has poured into the country while human trafficking and uncontrollable crime run rampant. Under President Biden's policies, every state is a border state. Border security is national security, and enough is enough. House Republicans voted again this week to make our nation safe and restore order to our nation's immigration system. It is time for President Biden to work with House Republicans to secure the southern border for good. Thank you again for having this special order hour, and I yield back.
Thank you to the gentleman from Kansas, and we appreciate the chair for the time today on this special order, and I will yield back the remainder of my time to the chair.
The gentleman yields back. Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs, is recognized for 60 seconds as the designee, 16 minutes, sorry, as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. 3 years ago, during my first year in Congress, I froze my eggs, which means I went through the first initial stages of IVF, except that after egg retrieval, my eggs were frozen and stored. For weeks, I took hormone pills, gave myself injections, and went to the doctor for checkups. Then I had a procedure under twilight sedation to harvest my eggs. Many people use IVF if they're single or LGBTQ+, if they're older or experiencing fertility issues or have suffered multiple miscarriages. But no matter the reason for IVF, it should be a valid and viable choice for anyone. But unfortunately, IVF, like many other reproductive health care options, is under attack in the courts and here in the halls of Congress. 184 of my Republican colleagues have co-sponsored legislation that supports fetal personhood, giving embryos the same full legal rights as a person. This fringe ideology is dangerous and could be used to prosecute people for miscarriages or for having an abortion, and could potentially affect access to birth control too. And it could threaten access to IVF. During IVF, doctors often create more fertilized embryos than they plan on using, because some may be genetically unviable or result in miscarriages. I have 17 mature eggs frozen. Patients like me pay for the storage of our eggs or embryos, and eventually some embryos are usually donated for medical research or destroyed. But fetal person legislation and even court rulings like the one in Alabama could force patients to pay for storage of their embryos forever, or leave clinics liable to criminal charges if embryos are damaged. That's why at least one IVF clinic in Alabama is ending the service. And this is just the beginning. Last week, Supreme Court Justice Alito acknowledged fetal personhood in his line of questioning in Moyle versus United States, a case that could decide the future of emergency abortion care. So I say this to my Republican colleagues. You can't support fetal personhood and support IVF access. You can't falsely claim to be pro-life and then rip away people's dreams of having children, and you can't hide and try to bury your true end goal. So I call on all 184 House Republicans, including Speaker Johnson, who have co-sponsored legislation that would treat embryos as children and threaten access to IVF and other reproductive health services. Come to the House floor. Publicly remove your name from this bill. Prove that you support IVF access. Prove that you support families, and prove that you're not a hypocrite. I will now yield as much time as he may consume to my colleague from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Representative Jacobs, and thank you, Madam Speaker. First and foremost, let me just thank Representative Jacobs for her determined leadership on this particular issue, among many others. I stand here today in solidarity with Representative Jacobs, Representative Wild, the leaders of the pro-choice caucus in the United States Congress, to help shine a light, as my colleague from California has done so well, on House Republican hypocrisy. In February, as we now know, the Alabama Supreme Court issued a dangerous ruling that upended fertility care and opened the door for extremists to push through their destructive agenda. In the months that followed, as Representative Jacobs referenced, many House Republicans have rushed to this House floor, to any TV camera that they may be able to find, to profess their support for IVF, the reproductive technology in question. To them, I say the same admonition that Representative Jacobs offered. Your actions have clearly shown otherwise. They have already shown who you are and what you believe. Make no mistake, Madam Speaker, if given the chance. Unfortunately, extreme members of the Republican caucus will find every opportunity to deprive Americans of their fundamental freedoms, criminalizing abortion nationwide, prosecuting the doctors and nurses willing to perform life-saving care, and pursuing this dangerous legislation that Representative Jacobs so eloquently described. And we, of course, are already seeing the consequences of that extremism across the country. In Ohio, in Alabama, and in Florida, where just today, a ban on abortion past 6 weeks of pregnancy has taken effect. Madam Speaker, the American people will not stand for this. House Democrats will not stand for this. We will keep pushing back against these plans to drag Americans back to the laws of the last century, and we will keep working to protect the right of every woman to make her own health care decisions. I want to again salute Representative Jacobs, and in particular, I want to salute Representative Wild, who introduced legislation that this body must pass in the days and weeks ahead. I salute her for her leadership and her determination on behalf of every American in our land. And with that, I yield back to the chair, to Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, and Madam Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild, is recognized for the remainder of the hour as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that as of today, Florida's cruel and inhumane 6-week abortion ban has taken effect. Attacks on women's basic reproductive freedom have not and will not stop. And while days like today are difficult, they also remind us of the stakes that we are facing in this fight. I, for one, am proud to stand here and declare my unwavering support for reproductive freedom. When the Supreme Court took the cruel but unsurprising step to overturn Roe v. Wade, my heart broke for all the women whose basic reproductive freedom would now be in jeopardy. As a mother, a lawyer who used to represent healthcare providers, and as a sitting member of Congress, I have always believed that private medical decisions should be kept squarely between a woman and her healthcare provider. And after my immediate horror at the Dobbs decision faded, I started thinking about what other opportunities this would open up for far-right extremists to further control women's bodies and their healthcare decisions. It's why I worked hard with my staff in the year after Dobbs to draft and introduce the Access to Family Building Act, which would codify a right to in vitro fertilization and other assisted reproductive technologies at the federal level. Because I knew that extreme politicians intent on controlling women's bodies wouldn't stop at abortion rights. They were coming after all forms of reproductive health care. 1 month after I introduced this bill on the House floor, the Alabama State Supreme Court made the heartbreaking and cruel decision to classify frozen embryos as children, throwing IVF patients and providers into a state of confusion and panic. And we heard it almost immediately. Clinics that stopped doing the procedures at all, women who were in the middle of an IVF treatment cycle who literally had to just stop. On the heels of the Alabama decision, more than 150 of my colleagues signed on as co-sponsors of the bill. Numerous healthcare and advocacy organizations endorsed it, including the Military Families Association. And constituents across my community and throughout the country shared their own difficult fertility journeys. As someone who struggled with infertility myself, I know how heartbreaking and expensive this process can be. And I know for sure that politicians and courts should not have a say in how anyone chooses to start or grow their families. And don't let anyone tell you that it's just rich career women seeking to defer their childbearing years who rely on IVF. Over the past several months, I've been in close contact with both veterans and cancer patients, men and women, by the way, who have spoken about their own IVF needs and that their fears that this safe and reliable procedure may now be in jeopardy. The reality is, these are the stakes that we are dealing with. And the reason we're gathered here tonight is to shed light on additional pieces of legislation that some of our colleagues have introduced or supported, which, if enacted, could have the same repercussions as the Alabama decision. It's important to note that not everyone on the other side of the aisle is aligned on this issue, and I applaud the handful of my Republican colleagues that have signed on to the Access to Building Families Act to protect IVF and other forms of reproductive assistance. But there is a real and present threat that exists right here in Congress of extremists that have signaled their explicit intention to attack IVF and other forms of reproductive health care at the federal level. Make no mistake, any of these national bans that have been talked about or proposed that would classify frozen embryos as children would supersede state-level protections, thereby throwing IVF access into complete jeopardy nationwide. That includes in a state like mine, Pennsylvania, which currently has no such restrictions. A federal ban would absolutely affect every woman and couple in Pennsylvania and throughout the country trying to start a family that was experiencing infertility issues, requiring them to avail themselves of these type of reproductive technologies. So that's why I'm not going to stop fighting to protect it, and it's why I am proud to have received such overwhelming support for the Access to Family Building Act, and I hope that we will soon be able to bring this to a vote on the House floor. And with that, I reserve. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back.